Good morning, everyone. So I'm here to talk about cover crops. I'm not Janine Hazy. Janine Hazy is our farm advisor in Sutter and Yuba counties. She contributed to this presentation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about reseeding annual cover crops as well as other types, and Janine is really more of an expert on that particular system than I am, so she contributed to that, and that's why her name's here on the slide. You know, I've been doing this extension job for 30 years, and up until 15 or 20 years ago, I mean, you can see from a picture like that this cover crops thing's been around a long time and come in and out of fashion. Up until 15 or so years ago, if I went to a grower and mentioned cover crops to him, the reaction would be, hey, that's kind of some hippie thing, isn't it? I mean, I'm not into that. And so it was a little bit tough pushing the message about the potential benefits and downsides of these things, but it's become really more mainstream in recent years for reasons that I hope to try to communicate to you here. I'm going to talk I'll talk a little bit about the hows of cover cropping, but there is a lot of very specific information in terms of plugging in a particular species or mix and system that works in your particular situation, seeding rates, fertilization or no fertilization. Some of the details of those hows we just don't have a lot of time to get into today, but I'll touch on them a little bit. But I'll talk at least as much, if not a little bit more, about the whys of cover cropping and why we've seen kind of a resurgence of interest in these things in recent years. But in the vein of not being able to cover everything, if you just Google on walnut cover crops or almond cover crops, you can find a lot of information. These two publications are available from us. We've got one specifically targeted at walnut orchards, which could translate very easily into almond orchards. I think there's not that much difference, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time today talking about one system or the other, nor am I going to, although I know this is a young orchard meeting, what you use and how you manage it in a young orchard is not that much different than an older orchard, so I'm not going to try to make those distinctions today. But here's a good pub that you can get from our people up there on the screen. And then there's a really good, much thicker book on cover cropping in vineyards. And you say, well, I don't care about vineyards, I'm an orchard guy. That's fine. But there is a lot of good information here, details about seeding rates. And yeah, so this is a good resource too, and there's others, older pubs around. Like I said, these things have been around for years, and there's a lot of good information. The other thing is that if you get interested in if I talk you into some interest in this thing and trying these in your orchards, there are seed dealers and some consultants that really tend to there's a lot of seed dealers, but there's some that, a small subset of them that really kind of specialize in cover crops, and these people are really the best resources to seek out in terms of what may work best in your particular situation, how to manage them, and the whole thing. Catherine knows some that are some of these kinds of people that are active in your area. Janine over in Sutter Yuba knows people over there that tend to specialize in this. So if you try to find somebody that really specializes in cover crops, not just a seed dealer who's selling wheat seed, to every wheat grower in your region, you can get a lot of good information from those people too. And they're around. There's an outfit in Manteca in my area that's very good. So here and there you can find these kind of resources. And once you get interested, the next step would be to a person like that and say, hey, what do you think? What do you know really works well up in this particular area, in this soil, and under these conditions and so forth? And they'll take you they'll get you farther down the road than I can or than the books can. So there are 4 different kind of cover, and I'm talking cover crops here now. An agronomic crop that you stick in the middles, usually. You can cross seed them and grow them in the tree rows too if you want, but you have to have a way to get them out of there when their purpose has been served and they're not, and that can be done. But largely they're grown down the orchard middles. planted for a specific purpose, other than harvesting the crop. See a lot of intercrops, beans growing between rows of young walnut or almond orchards and other kinds of things, alfalfa. But I'm talking about an agronomic crop planted down the middles usually that is there for some agronomic purpose, usually related to soil and water quality. And I'm going to talk exclusively today about the first two up here on the screen, these so-called winter green manures that are planted in the fall, grown in the winter and early spring, and taken out in early springtime, either mowed off and allowed to decompose on the soil surface or dissed in. Or these so-called annual reseeding crops that are also planted in the fall, allowed to grow in the winter, but allowed to grow a little bit longer into the spring and even in an early summer, May, June-ish time, until they set seeds. Then they're mowed off. You can't use these annual reseeding mixtures or crops in disc orchards. They're mowed off, and those seeds are there, and they germinate the following fall. So you have kind of a self-renewing system, whereas the green manures need to be replanted every year because you're tilling under or mowing off just vegetative material long before they go to seed. We don't really see many perennial grasses or legumes mixtures or stands in orchards because you got to have a full coverage irrigation system. They're there all year long, sucking water and nutrients. There are some advantages, but we just don't see them in a walnut orchard. By mature walnut orchards, there's just not enough light to sustain a sod crop through the whole season. So we don't see those much in orchard systems. And I've seen warm season annual crops like buckwheat, even Sudan, cowpeas, grown in orchard middles in the summertime. Usually using these species that are fast developing and get a decent biomass. Again, you need a full coverage irrigation system to sustain them. To put organic matter in the soil for some other purposes during the summer, but if you're going to do that, you might as well grow one of these winter mixes that don't have the downsides of having plant material there in the summertime that you have to keep watered and potentially have to fertilize to get a good stand. But there are warm season annuals used for that purpose too. So a little bit about pros and cons of cover crops in general. One of the big reasons that orchardists like these things is that, especially in the winter and spring, they provide you better flotation to get through the orchard with equipment, and in heavy ground or wet ground, that's an advantage. The next two on this list, this water penetration and pulling out excess soil moisture in the early spring, are really the two benefits that I see walnut and almond growers using cover crops for more than most of these other advantages. The organic matter that these things are putting in the soil improves soil structure and therefore water penetration. Root channels that are left by a lot of these more deep-rooted plants that you're putting down the middles improve water penetration, and this particular advantage I've seen non-believers turn into believers, after a couple of years with cover crops, and that's been encouraging. If the cover crop has a legume in it, some do, some don't. You can count on some nitrogen fixation and a little bit of boost in the nitrogen supply to the soil system, and thereby over time to the trees. There may be some use in terms of what I mean by conservation is a grass cover crop could also potentially pull excess nitrogen out of the soil. If you're worried about nitrogen leaching, for example, convert it into more stable kind of organic forms, put it back in there, and it's there less likely ultimately to leaching than it would be if it as a straight fertilizer. But this nitrogen producing capability of cover crops has long time been one of the reasons why growers are using them, using mixes that have legumes in them or using straight legumes. I think you're going to see more interest in this runoff and erosion advantage of cover crops now, with more orchards being planted in the hills. I don't know if it's happening up here. It's certainly happening in my area, and the Water Resources Control Board is getting very getting a big burr under their saddle about off-site movement of suspended soil. And so there's some of these cover crops that will slow water down as it's moving out of your orchard, trap soil sediments, and there may be some benefit there. And there's lots of research showing that that kind of action can also slow down the off-site movement of pesticide residues that are bound to soil particles. So something there, but you really, you can talk to me another time about this. You really, to do that, you need a cover crop that's really going to ramp up quickly in the winter time and be there in the late winter, springtime when rains are going to potentially move stuff off-site, and not all of them will get you a stand that's big enough and strong enough to really do that. So that requires a kind of a special approach. The shading out of weeds is an additional advantage. Not one of the core reasons for using cover crops, because you're improving soil structure, a little bit less dust potential, I suppose. And the beneficial insect and nematode thing has been a mixed bag. Personally, first of all, it's not a reason that growers typically put cover crops in their orchard. Secondly, there's not a big stack of research publications about documenting the potential benefits in terms of, the idea is you're providing nectar and pollen sources for beneficial insects or habitat for predators and that kind of thing. There have been some of these benefits have been documented, but there's more tests that have shown there's really not a whole lot of benefit in that respect. And there also is a little bit of literature about the suppressive effects of certain, I'm going to say mostly cold crop plants like radishes and mustard, suppressive effects on nematodes. But you can't just plant any old mustard or any old radish and expect to get impacts like that. The effects like that have been documented, but for very specific species under very specific circumstances. So you'd have to pick one of these other reasons for growing cover crops and hope that, and maybe incorporate a plant or two in there that might have some of these other effects, but it wouldn't be my main reason for using them. Downsides. It's a lot more plants in your orchard that are going to use water when the environmental conditions are right to water use and the plant material is there. So, here's an example where a winter cover crop, a decent stand, could use as much as 2.5 or 3 inches of water over the course of the winter. If you're relying on that water, like we have been in drought years, to percolate into the soil and be part of the reservoir that's going to supply your orchard for the early part of the following season, then that's a loss. By the same token, if you're counting on that water to be pushing sodium, chloride, boron out of the soil profile as part of your leaching fraction, that's water that's not going to do that anymore. It's going to be going off into the atmosphere and being incorporated into these plants. So the water use is a downside, but like I said earlier, these green manure crops, normally they're being put out they're taken down by before the time of your first irrigation. Occasionally they're there through one irrigation, but not a big problem. The self-reseeding ones are there into May and sometimes even early June. There's a potential for water use there, and granted, they're taking water out of the soil that could otherwise be used by the trees, but they're not taking much, and you actually want to manage that stand of self-reseeding ones to keep them on the dry side anyway, to push forward their seed production so you can get them out of the orchard as quickly as possible. With a big tall cover crop, it's pretty hard to get through that field with a brush rake to push brush out of the orchard, or pruning towers are running over a cover crop stand that's just beginning to get some steam behind it is going to damage your cover crop stand. So things like mowing for navel orangeworm late in the winter or pruning operations are a problem. You can get around this. There's a number of workarounds. One is only plant cover crops in alternate rows and use the open ones for doing some of these operations. That's the only workaround I can think of right now. Or the other one is just don't plant them the year you're planning to prune. I mean, for small pruning, young orchards, not that big of a deal, but for mature orchards, you're talking about having to balance the cover crop stand and its management with what you're doing in the orchard. And there are some cover crop species that are alternate hosts for plant parasitic nematodes that may be of concern to almonds and walnuts, and you have to kind of tread this one a little bit carefully too, but it's not a, in my mind anyway, it's not a big consideration compared to some of these other downsides. And if you've got a insulating layer of plant material growing up and down your orchard middles in the springtime when it's cold, I mean, that's going to insulate the earth from getting warmed up during the daytime and re-radiating that heat at night, and so you do have increased measure of frost risk with these, vegetation growing out there other than the trees. So that has to be taken into consideration. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about these two groups. And so the first one, these green manure crops, by and large, normally oftentimes they're a mixture of some grass species, wheat, barley, oats, and a legume or two or three, beans, vetches, peas. The legumes are there. Most of them are a little bit slower to take off in the winter than the grasses. The legumes are there for the nitrogen. The grasses are there to support the legumes, the ones that are trailing, and they're there to provide more biomass that's going to contribute to organic matter enhancement in the orchard. This is actually a mistake here. This mustard, that's not a mixture, is it? But anyway, the other ones are. Or there are pure stands, and the two group, you got grasses or legumes, and there are a number of legumes that'll work fine as pure stands, but you're generally reducing the amount of organic matter that's out there, but you're getting more nitrogen. And the grasses are the flip side, getting more biomass but no nitrogen. In fact, in some instances, it's helpful to these grass cover crops to fertilize them a little bit to get maximum biomass by the time you're taking them out. And triticale is a big one in my area. I don't know about up here. There are certain selections of triticale that, and this is a wheat rye hybrid, if I remember right. Certain varieties grow very well in the wintertime, or grow very well in the fall and early wintertime, kind of hang in there in the wintertime, and then when springtime comes and the weather warms up, they really take off and grow quickly. So some varieties grow better than others, and this is why it's good to talk to seed dealers. All right. A little bit about management. I told you I was going to talk more about the whys and the hows, but as they affect the choice of the system and the choice of the specific species that you'd want to put in there, a couple things to keep in mind. Like I said earlier, if you don't plant alternate middles and allow yourself some alleyways to do orchard pruning operations, you got to get the pruning stuff done before these things are planted. Because if you roll over them with pruning equipment when they're germinating, you're going to have ruts through there that aren't where the seeds aren't going to germinate. And if you roll through there as they germinate and struggling, you're going to negatively impact the cover crop. So you really can't do it. Once it gets established fairly well, you can roll over it to a certain extent. But if it's 3 or 4 feet tall, it's not a working proposition. So by and large, with these green manures, it's a matter of getting all your preparation and planting, and in many cases, watering up if you don't get lucky and get a shot of rain after they've been seeded before the weather gets cold. You got to do all that between harvest and the onset of winter rains, and that's pretty tricky, especially for a variety like a late maturing, a light harvesting walnut variety like Chandler or some of the other ones. Well, almond's not going to have so much problem, but that can be tricky, and it requires really good planning. Have the seed lined up, have the seeder guy ready to go, get in there right after harvest, and do whatever soil prep you need to do for planting and so forth. There's lots of ways to plant these things. You can broadcast and roll. You can use one of various kinds of drills to seed these things. And I want to emphasize this last point. I mean, critical to these green manure crops in particular is you got to make sure that the germination conditions are ideal for these things, insofar as you really have a narrow time window to get these things established, up and growing before the winter cold sets in and they're just going to sit there. So you got to irrigate them up if you don't get rain at just the right time, and that means you need a solid set irrigation system to be able to do that. With a drip or micros or anything else that doesn't cover the whole orchard floor, you're relying on winter rains to get the maximum benefit out of these things. As far as taking them out goes, it's really quite simple. It's a matter of trying to maximize the biomass and the nitrogen fixation, and that's a matter of letting them grow till you're at, if you've got legumes, 5, 10, 15% bloom on those things is about when they peak out in terms of the nitrogen fixation and accumulation in the above ground biomass. So it's a matter of balancing the need to get those things out of the orchard because you got other things going on versus maximizing the amount of biomass that's there. And balancing also this business, I said one of the advantages that my growers have seen in these cover crops is the ability in a wet winter of taking out some excess soil moisture, and if you're going to time taking these things out based on that, you're cutting a narrow swath between getting them out leaving them there long enough to get the maximum benefit from that versus a point where the weather and the soil moisture gets to the point where the cover crop is starting to compete with the trees for water. So another thing to keep in mind in taking these cover crops out. Because I'm not going to say too much about cover crop as a source of nitrogen. These legumes do fix nitrogen when mowed off and left on the surface to decompose or tilled into the orchard floor. That nitrogen that they fixed goes back into the soil, into the nitrogen pool, gets broken down, and eventually gets mineralized, and it's available to the tree. Most of it's in the above ground part of the legume. Different legumes, as it says here, different legumes fix different amounts, and the amount of nitrogen a legume fixes depends on how well the thing is growing, whether it's got the right bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria associated with the plant. That means that your cover crop legume seeds need to be inoculated, either pre-inoculated from the supplier or by you in the hopper. And you can get better recovery of that nitrogen that's created and captured from a cover crop when it's tilled in, as opposed to leaving it on the soil surface where some of the nitrogen goes off as it's volatilized as ammonia and loss. These figures for mowing and incorporating are conservative. Most people would probably tell you the mowing is you're going to get back probably more like 60-70%, and with disking you're going to get 75 or 80. But I like, in terms of estimating what I'm getting, I like to be on the conservative side, and then if I get more, I feel good about it. And there are ways to, as we get into these nitrogen management plans and you're needing to estimate the offtake of nitrogen and the input of nitrogen with what you're doing, this may become more important. There are published estimates about how much a stand of vetch, for example. A stand of vetch, we can get 100, 150 units if you manage things right and things go well. So you can get a lot of nitrogen potentially out of these things. But if you really want to know the exact amount of nitrogen that you're getting, then you're getting down to staying out of the books and looking for published estimates and really collecting samples, drying them, taking them to a lab, which is very straightforward and not expensive, having them analyzed for the amount of N that's there, and then back calculating how much, making a decision about what percent recovery you're probably getting, and then back calculating to roughly how much nitrogen you think you're getting from these things. All right, now these annual reseeding things. So these are the ones where we're seeding them in the fall the first time, growing them through the winter, but we're leaving them longer into the summer until they set their own seed. We mow it off. Those seed go back in the soil and germinate the following year. There are, the same way as these green manure crops, there are legumes to be used for this purpose. If you're, I see it. You don't. She's waving a 5-minute thing in back at me in the back there. There are legumes that can be used for this purpose, like these. There are grasses that can be used for this purpose. There's a smaller number of grasses than there are legumes that have been kind of found to really work well in this system. The two grasses are this Oro fescue and Blando brome. And there's mixes of the two. Although these mixes, in my mind anyway, when you put Blando brome growing up on top of a low-lying clover or medic, those legumes have a pretty tough time competing with the shade from that grass that's growing there. So, in my experience, I've seen more solid stands of either grasses or legumes than mixtures. All right. Now, I've already talked about this, but these are planted in the fall, managed during the wintertime and the early summer to try to get the things up and into seed production as quickly as possible. Mowed off up here would be late May to early June. They reseed, and if you do everything right, you're good to go. These advantages are very similar to the green manure advantages. It's sort of a misstatement to say no extra summer irrigation. I mean, first of all, to get a good biomass, these things, you do need at least one irrigation, which means you need a full coverage irrigation system. In the mid to late spring to really get the biomass and get these things up and running. But once you got that biomass, they actually benefit from being stressed a little bit, forces them into seed production a little bit quicker. But it's kind of a misstatement to say they need no extra summer irrigation. And I've already talked about these other advantages that are true for these as they are for the green manure crops. And I've got ahead of myself earlier on, but unlike the green manure crops, usually you're going to have to irrigate these at least once in the early spring to get them up to full size. Unlike the green manures, the normal process here is to come in the end of February, early March, and give them a 1 or 2 inch mowing. That'll knock the top off of these cover crops, but they'll regrow, and it'll take out a lot of the weeds that would otherwise be there competing. They won't tolerate this mowing as well as these reseeding cover crops will, and you get a little bit of a weed control and therefore better cover crop growth and seed production. All right, so that's that on that. Up here you're in a little bit better position than we are down in the northern San Joaquin Valley in terms of being able to rely on fall rainfall to get these things out of the ground, being able to rely on some decent amount of rainfall during the winter time to promote the growth of these things during the winter and early spring. But in a drought year, or if you're relying on surface water, you're going to be more challenged than if you got a well and you don't have water availability restrictions in terms of these irrigation needs of these crops. Okay? Some ideas about what kind of nitrogen is available from these things. The analysis protocol that I described to you before for green manure would be the same one you would use for these kind of crops, and in the same way as the green manures, the more biomass you have, the more nitrogen you're going to have there for potential capture and later use by the orchard. There have been some experiences where particularly gophers, and gophers really like, I don't know if Roger's still here, I could get in trouble. Gophers really like the cover of this stuff in the orchard middles, and if you put a clover or legume in there, they really like to, some of those are a good food source for gophers, so gophers in particular can be a little bit more of a problem. Particularly with these legume cover crops and particularly with perennial ones that are out there all season long. The two groups we've talked about, not so much of a problem because they're really only there for 3 or 4 months. And The point here at the bottom is that in terms of meeting the nitrogen needs of your young orchard, it's probably a good idea to band nitrogen down the edges of your herbicide treated strips rather than broadcasting nitrogen, because when you broadcast it, the cover crop's going to take it. We're going to have first dibs on it. Band it near the trees, then it's available to the trees and not so much to the cover crop.